Can you imagine what a shock it would be if someone in the 1970s, when I was in elementary school, uh, stepped through a doorway and they arrived in 2025 in that same classroom, and you're seeing 60% obesity in the children as opposed to maybe one kid who's a little bit overweight in the
Yeah.
classroom. It's a shocker, but because it happened gradually, we don't really think about it. And the same for the autism, the same for the other metabolic disorders, the diabetes, for these estrogen-mediated cancers. They're all getting worse. And what's the one thing that has been consistently occurring across this time? It's been more and more use of chemicals. So the volume, the number, all of that constantly increasing.
Hello, Frank. So I'd like to start this podcast off with potatoes. So it all started with the potato, and I'll kind of let you take it from there. But that was one of the most interesting things I took away from your book and how we entered into this chemical dependent food production era.
Yeah, the potato famine in Ireland is a very interesting example that relates very strongly to the history of pesticides because prior to that famine, which was in the 1840s, there was no way for scientists to combat plant pathogens, that is, things that infect plants. In this case, the potato blight that swept across Ireland was caused by a water mold, and there was no way to treat it, and Ireland was quite vulnerable to it because the peasant class of Ireland, which was around 90% of the population, relied exclusively on this monoculture of potatoes to survive, and they had been driven to marginal lands where that's the only thing that could be grown. So it's also an example of globalization of trade because the potato was originally from the Americas, from the Incan Empire, and it was brought over to Europe in the 1500s, and then the water mold came over with the passage of potato seeds and potato crops in the 1840s, and there was no way to stop it. So about 20 years after the potato famine, which led to the death of 1 million Irishmen and also 1 million Irish emigrated from Ireland to America, Australia, and other places. And about 20 years later, that led to the first commercial pesticide, which was a copper sulfate or Bordeaux mixture that was used to combat water molds.
And I think it's always important to reflect back, like, why did the famine happen? So what were the conditions that led to the potatoes, you know, well, I think it's important to remember at that time, potatoes were like the food staple for that region of the world. But what conditions, the environmental conditions, living conditions led to this disease that took over the potato fields and then removed a bunch of their food source. And so when people aren't consuming calories, energy, nutrition, their body is susceptible to disease and then enter the potato famine, Irish famine. So what were the living and environmental conditions that potentially led to this outbreak?
Well, the English had a set of ferocious laws against the Catholic population of Ireland, where they couldn't own the land. They were peasant farmers who were growing export crops for their British landlords, and then they had to subsist on the marginal parts of the lands on with rapidly growing population. And the only food that would grow on those lands and support those families was the potatoes. So they ended up over a couple of hundred years developing this complete reliance on the potato because it turns out the potato has almost everything you need to survive, and you just need a little bit of protein besides that, and it's a quite a nutritious crop. But of course, then we're relying on this monoculture. So when the water mold swept through Ireland, it caused widespread famine. It swept through all of Europe, but in other parts of Europe, potatoes were just one of many crops. And in Ireland, for that population, it was the crop. And like you mentioned, that made the people susceptible to disease. So most people didn't actually quote unquote die of starvation. Their immune system started to shut down and they died of typhus and relapsing fever, which are zoonotic diseases that are vectored by the body loss.
One thing I read in your book was that for some reason the French and the British didn't like the potato, like it was looked down upon. Why why at the time did they not like potatoes? It was too low of class for them or something like that.
Well, there was some logic to it in the sense that it belongs to the deadly nightshade family, and there are
Mm.
poisonous plants in that family. And so I think there was some fear around that, and also fear of the unknown because this was a crop that came from the Americas and people weren't familiar with it. And so the French king actually kind of tricked the French population to get to like it by having guards guard his potato crop, but letting people sneak through and steal from them. And that's how it kind of got started in France. In some parts of Europe, it got embraced more quickly. Initially, like you said, there was resistance in the United Kingdom, but it didn't take long for the peasant class to realize that this was a quite a nutritious crop they could grow on small amount of land and support a family.
Okay. So I think that that potato story is an interesting place to start when we bring up this whole larger pesticide conversation because it was one of the first times where, we're seeing monoculture, overpopulation, trying to produce as much food as possible in small areas. And that's kind of what we're doing today with vast monoculture fields throughout the country, trying to produce mass amounts of food for more and more people. And when I think back to your book, I just think of the potato. It all started with the potato. So I want to give a proper introduction. So today we are honored to be joined by Frank von Hippel, who is a professor of environmental health sciences and is the lead of One Health Research Initiative at the University of Arizona. His book, The Chemical Age, it outlines like the whole history of chemical pesticides and how we got to this point of being so reliant on chemicals. And his research and work is in the field of ecotoxicology and the mechanisms of toxicity. And he has done research all over the world. He's one of those people that doesn't just talk about the problems, he's actually doing something to fix the problem. And now he's one of the most well versed in how pesticides came to be, the problems we now face being in this chemical era. So I think a good place to start would be what impact is this chemical pesticide reliance that we have in our agriculture system that didn't exist prior to the 1800s? What are the problems that we are seeing on human health?
It's a great question, and thanks for that introduction. It was overly generous, but I appreciate it. So you're right. We are relying. We have a rapidly growing human population. It has been growing rapidly for several hundred years. One way I like to think about it is my grandfather was born in 1898, and he died in 2003. So he lived in 3 centuries, 105 years old when he died. But when he was born, there was something like 1.5 billion people in the world. And when he died, there were over 6 billion people in the world. So in one man's lifetime, the world's population more than quadrupled. And that's just kind of mind-boggling. And in order to feed all those people, we've shifted from small scale agriculture, which would have been the norm when he was born all over the world, to these massive industrial farms, monocultures, as you say. And when you have a farm at that scale that's a monoculture, by definition, you're creating a landscape that is going to be attractive to pests, right? So you have insects and you have other pests that come in and they have this abundant food supply. And so the pest populations will explode. And that means that the farmers are going to use a lot of chemicals to combat those pests. So we built into our industrial agricultural system a reliance on pesticides. And that reliance becomes stronger and stronger because the more chemicals we use, the more the pests, let's just use insects as the example, evolve resistance to those chemicals. So then we have to use more chemicals, more different kinds of chemicals, and constantly changing it up and relying more and more on the chemical industry. So just one statistic that might help understand this is when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962, she warned the world of this problem. And by the turn of the century, so by 2000, we were using about 4 times the volume of pesticides in the world as we were using in 1962 when she wrote the book. And that's just built into the way that we do industrial agriculture.
I think it's important for people to understand who Rachel Carson is. At the time, pesticides were new coming out of the world wars. Pesticides were increasing more and more into our food system. But then there was this brave soul that decided to say, like, hold up the red flag, like, hey, we really need to think more about this because we don't know the long term consequences. And I know that you've spoken a number of times how she's influenced your work. So, what were some of the things that Rachel Carson brought up in her Silent Springs back in 1962 that we just ignored and we're seeing today?
Yeah, it's a great question. In some ways, her book was not ignored. It was very important because it really galvanized the environmental movement. And what we saw after the publication of Silent Spring was a shift, at least at first in America, but then around the world, in the way that we think about environmental problems. So that led to seminal environmental legislation in the United States. We had in 1968 the National Environmental Policy Act. And then between 1970 and 1974, we got the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, the formation of the EPA, basically all of the critical Endangered Species Act, all of the critical environmental legislation passed during that time frame. And it's politically interesting because at that time the legislature, the Congress, was controlled by Democrats, and we had a Republican president, Nixon, who signed all that legislation. It was bipartisan. So there was broad support for doing something about the environment. It wasn't just Rachel Carson's warning. We also had rivers catching on fire in the United States. We had risks and dangers. We had scares over contamination of the food supply, like the cranberry scare in 1959. We had people terrified of nuclear fallout from testing of nuclear weapons. All of these things were coming together. But Rachel Carson basically galvanized that. And she was an incredible writer. This was her last book. She died shortly after writing the book, but she was an incredible writer. She'd already been a multiple best-selling author of nonfiction about the environment. And so it was the combination of her careful writing about the issue, but also just the way she could do it. Because imagine if, Sarah and Ashley, if you guys were setting out to write a book about pesticides, how could you do that without making your audience fall asleep on the first page? It's very difficult. But she did it. And you actually, when you read the book, you'll see she talked about nuclear fallout long before she talked about pesticides. So she used what people were concerned about at the time to make parallels and draw attention to the problem of pollution of the environment.
Well, I think that that's like an important point to bring up now. So, Frank, why should, truthfully, I love regenerative agriculture. I love soil microbiome. I love the microbes in the soil. No one cares about that. People care about their health. They care about their kids' health and they want to try to be as healthy as possible. So, why should people care about the massive use of pesticides, which isn't just in agriculture? I kind of cringe thinking back to 12 years of golf because I was on golf courses multiple hours per day being exposed to pesticides everywhere. And, we've got parks and lawn care and in our food. So, why should people care about pesticide use?
Right. It's a great question. So, just from a personal point of view, if we ignore the environmental impact of it, which is huge, of course, many people care about the environment, and pesticides are one of the big contributors to decline of species extinction and so on. But if we ignore that and we just talk about the human health side of it, pesticides have a large impact on health, and there are many mechanisms for this. It's actually interesting to go back and read Silent Spring now because at that time in 1962, we did not know the major mechanisms of toxicity of pesticides. And so Rachel Carson, she focused on cancer in the book. She talked over and over about cancer. And it is true that some pesticides are carcinogenic. So that is an effect of some pesticides. But it's not the main mechanism by which pesticides disrupt health. The primary mechanism is actually endocrine disruption, so disruption of hormone systems. And that's something that was only discovered in the 1990s. So it's also a good example of how oftentimes or typically, we find there's something that's toxic. We don't know why. And it can take decades to figure out what's the mechanism by which this is toxic. But from a personal point of view, if you're exposed to pesticides, what we really have to worry about the most is the baby in the womb and the developing child, because it's during those sensitive windows of development that endocrine disrupting chemicals have their largest effects, including potentially later onset cancers or developmental disorders.
Wow.
So, this season of our podcast, we've been talking a lot about preparing for pregnancy, fertility, and many issues that arise in this process for both the male and the female. Can you talk a little bit about the issues with preconception prep for having a child on the male perspective and also the female perspective when you're exposed to pesticides in the environment and in your foods?
Sure, and more generally, just chemicals. So there's something we call the developmental origins of health and disease. It's a mouthful, but essentially what it means is that there are early life stressors, whether that's chemical stressors or famine would be another example, where it can lead to later onset developmental disorders or disease. So, for example, you can even have effects on the sperm and the egg due to chemical stressors that can lead to later onset disease. So,
Mm.
for that reason, it's particularly important for the pregnant women to avoid chemical exposures as much as possible so that her baby has the best chance of a healthy life. And it's you can think to an example like say fetal alcohol syndrome. You might have two women who both get drunk sometime in pregnancy. One of them has a baby with FAS and the other one doesn't. And you could ask, well, why? Well, part of it has to do with the timing because we are developing over that 9 month period of pregnancy, we're developing different parts of the body at different times. And some of those parts are very sensitive to these exposures and some of them are not. So, with regard to pesticide exposures, as those systems are being developed in the fetus, then of course you could have disruption of those systems. So much of it relies on hormonal changes in the mother and in the baby. And of course, the baby during early pregnancy is getting the hormones from the mother, and then as the baby's uh, endocrine system develops, it starts to take over its own function. And the placenta is also an endocrine organ, so it's also part of the mother, part of the baby, and very important in all of this. So it's kind of a short way to answer, but also during early childhood, just as much as possible to avoid chemicals such as pesticides or avoid, say, microwaving plastics and then eating the food from that because there's all kinds of chemicals that one can be exposed to. We want to keep that exposure as little as possible.
Can we, like, nerd out just, like, slightly? What is the so we know that pesticides are harmful to health. There's more and more data showing that the reason for that is endocrine disruption. Why do they disrupt our hormones? Like, what's the mechanism there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one way to think about it is first, let's just define what a hormone is. A hormone is a chemical that goes into the circulatory system and it communicates something from one part of the body to another part of the body. So, for example, neurotransmitters are not hormones because they're just going cell to cell in the brain. They're not going through circulation. But if we can think about hormones as having 6 steps in their life. So the first step is synthesis. They have to be made. The second step is storage. Not all hormones are stored, but many, such as thyroid hormone, are stored. The third step is transportation in the bloodstream, so circulation. The fourth step is binding to a receptor somewhere. So, like with thyroid hormone, it's binding to a receptor and turning. And then the fifth step is post binding action. It's turning on some kind of change, like a change in gene expression. And then the sixth step is degradation. So, with thyroid hormone, you cleave off an iodide. You go from T4 to T3. You have a more active form of the hormone. You cleave off another iodide, and it's no longer active. So that's 6 steps in the life of a hormone. A chemical might disrupt any of those steps. And if any of those steps are disrupted, that's endocrine disruption. So we can take the example, let's say, of DDT. DDT is estrogenic, so it binds to the estrogen receptor and it turns on the suite of effects of estrogen. That's one mechanism by which DDT is causing endocrine disruption. So that would be step four, the binding to the target receptor. But there are examples. Another one is we have a problem in the United States and other industrialized countries of a water contaminant called perchlorate. And perchlorate outcompetes iodide at the protein that imports iodide to the thyroid. And we need 4 iodines for each thyroid hormone. So by blocking iodide uptake at the thyroid, it leads to hypothyroidism. So that would be preventing the creation of the hormone. So it's preventing step one of the life of the hormone. And I could give you examples with all 6 steps of different chemicals that that impact each of those steps.
Oh, yeah. So the DDT in particular, you said it's turning on the mechanisms of estrogen. So with this in mind, when we're thinking about female fertility and male fertility at this point too, how is this contributing to issues with hormonal balance or getting pregnant, the estrogen side of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I also didn't answer the male side of the question from before. So maybe I'll address the male side first and then talk
Okay.
about both male and female. So one of the one of the things that scientists have been studying over the last 30 years or so is that there's been a precipitous decline in male sperm counts in industrialized countries since the 1950s. And now they're a little less than half of what they were then. And we know this by people going back and looking at archived sperm samples from back then and comparing sperm counts, and also just from sperm count data, sperm banks over those decades. So there are a lot of people trying to understand what is the cause of this precipitous decline in sperm counts, but it's also a decline in sperm quality. And a lot of that appears to be due to chemicals, not just pesticides, but there are about 230,000 synthetic chemicals in the environment that humans have made. We make about 10,000 new chemicals a year that then get into the environment. So it's a massive problem, well beyond just pesticides. And we don't fully understand how those chemicals are disrupting sperm production and sperm quality, but some of the mechanisms are known. They have to do with disruption of the hormonal signaling involved in sperm production. So that's the male side, but it's also female fertility. And if you look at what are the causes of infertility, many people are experiencing infertility now, much more than in the past. Some of it, of course, is people are having babies when they're older, and the older we are, the lower the fertility. But some of it is chemical exposure. About a third of infertility is female infertility. About a third of it is male infertility, and about a third is some combination of male and female infertility. So, with regard to these chemicals that disrupt hormones, the most common avenue of disruption are estrogenic effects, chemicals that bind to the estrogen receptor and they're turning on estrogen, which has implications for disease like cancer. There are estrogen mediated diseases such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, and others. But also, it has implications for the complex suite of things that happens to prepare for ovulation, to prepare for pregnancy. So, the female endocrine system is quite complex, and there's a kind of a concert going on between changes in the various hormones. And you can imagine if you're changing levels of one hormone or you're turning on signaling of one, that can disrupt it. Something that's important to this that we need to understand is that hormones are in what we call an endocrine axis, where they're auto-regulating. So as we produce a hormone, let's just use thyroid hormone as an example. The thyroid gland makes T4, thyroxine, and that T4 then goes into circulation and it turns off its own production by negatively inhibiting the hypothalamus from producing thyroid releasing hormone. So the normal pathway to make thyroid hormone is the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, makes thyroid releasing hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to make thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to make thyroxine or T4. And once that T4 is made, it shuts down its own production. So there's this negative feedback. And we also have what's called endocrine crosstalk, where one axis actually influences another, like thyroid hormones can influence sex steroids, such as estrogen. So it's actually really complicated. And you can imagine disrupting one part of that can disrupt the system, which could impact fertility, impact pregnancy, and so on.
Wow, yeah. I mean, we talk a lot on our, in our newsletters and social media about estrogen dominance. It's a really common issue with not only younger women, but women in all stages of their life. And I mean, there's been such a push for pro-estrogen, and in many ways, yes, you still need estrogen, but the negative consequences of being exposed to so many different things in the environment, like you said, the 10,000 new chemicals a year, which I'd like to talk about too, because I had listened to another podcast you were on where you said that the burden of proof to show that those chemicals are harmful to humans is essentially on us to prove. They're not really being tested prior to an extent that's appropriate. So we need to talk about that. But yeah, I mean, this makes sense why so many women have such imbalanced hormones, and they could be doing what they perceive as everything correct as far as they're exercising, they're eating, the different foods that they're being told to eat. But it's so challenging in the environment that we live in to avoid all these different chemicals. And do you have any practical tips for somebody? Let's say they are dealing with they're estrogen dominant, they're having a hard time with fertility, and maybe their husband is too, but that's really not as much talked about. Like, you're one of the very few people who bring up that issue. Do you have any practical tips for how they could start taking steps in their environment to reduce this exposure, to let their bodies naturally come back into balance?
Yeah, it's a great question. And before I answer that, I do want to say that there is a place for hormone replacement therapy for menopausal, postmenopausal women. So that's a separate issue that is not what I'm talking about here. So many women benefit from that when they have gone through menopause. But in terms of your question about exposure, so there are, I would say, two major exposures to estrogenic chemicals that we would want to avoid, especially if the person has a genetic predisposition towards estrogen mediated cancer, such as breast cancer. So, like if they have the BRCA gene that makes them more susceptible to breast cancer, it's very important to avoid extra estrogens beyond the self produced estrogens. One of those sources of exposure are phytoestrogens, so plants that also mimic estrogen. You might ask, why would plants have chemicals that mimic estrogen or mimic other chemicals? Plants can't run away from their predators. And so plants have evolved chemicals to defend themselves. And there are two major categories of these chemicals. There are the toxic ones like cyanide that plants produce so that they won't get eaten. But there are also other ones that make them difficult to digest or impact the reproduction of their predators, like the phytoestrogens. And so soy, for example, is a plant that is high in phytoestrogen. So women who are sensitive to breast cancer would need to avoid soy and other similar kinds of
I
plants.
think
But yes,
flax is the number one source of phytoestrogen. So it goes flax and soy are like orders of magnitude higher, but those are like the two biggest sources.
great. I didn't know about flax, so that's good to know.
Flax is higher than soy, and
Okay.
it's, like, embedded in everything. Like, you go look at, like, multi-seed breads, and there's always flax seed or something like that in it. So I think paying attention to ingredients for looking out for those too.
Yeah, great. And then a second source, of course, are these chemicals that are estrogenic, and there are many thousands of them. So that's a difficult thing to know how to do. I would say, the kind of good practice would just be to have you can. One of the things that I like about working in this field is there are many aspects of it you can control yourself. So if you're a climate change scientist, you might feel like, what could I possibly do to impact this? Right? It's such a global scale thing, and whatever I do will have no impact. But with regard to chemical exposures, there's a lot you can do. You can avoid those chemicals in your own home, and you can make choices about the food that you buy and so on. So many people are actually exposing themselves to dangerous chemicals through, like you mentioned, pesticides in the home. They're spraying for insects and things like that. I never use pesticides in my home, and there are non-chemical solutions to all of those pest problems. And then there's the food we buy. Most of us can't afford to buy only organic food, but there are good tools out there where you can look up the pesticide residues on the food. Like Environmental Working Group has a tool, and there are others. You can get the app for it at the grocery store. You can look up, which foods are high. You say, oh, strawberries are high. I'll buy organic strawberries. Have that be part of my budget, but maybe these other ones are low in residues. I don't need to worry about it. So there's all of that. And then there are many other chemicals like we were discussing. So I, for example, never microwave plastic, and I don't cook with cookware that has PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and nonstick coating. There's a lot of things like that we can do to avoid exposure, and even the household products that we buy. So it's better to have old natural things like wood and wool and things like that than you go and you might buy a carpet and it's loaded with flame retardant chemicals, and those are thyroid disrupting chemicals. So there's a lot we can do once we are educated about it to avoid exposing ourselves, exposing our families, exposing our neighbors.
Yeah. You're no kidding about the exposures in the house. My husband and I just bought it was a newly constructed house, and I didn't really think of it when we were going through the purchase process,
Well, you
but
didn't build it.
I didn't get to choose the materials used to build the house, but once I got in there, I started, like, picking I had to email the person who built it. I was, like, just curious, like, "What materials did you use for the floor?" Because it's all vinyl flooring, and, "What paints did you use?" And all these different questions because, yeah, certain floors are gonna have more VOCs, the volatile organic compounds that are gonna contribute to some sort of all the different 5-stage mechanisms that you talked about in the body, they could break up any part of that stage and impact you negatively. So there's so many things, the walls, the paint. Fortunately, the paint used in my house was already the low VOC. I think that there is some amount of awareness out there about this now that's, making even larger companies make better decisions for the safety of somebody being in their own home, but a lot of it doesn't mean that all the older homes too are safe because there's so many things that we used in the past, like lead, that could contribute to health issues. So it's no joke that it's very challenging to literally just feel safe in your home. And it's really about little decisions, making compromises in some areas, like you said, with the dirty dozen and clean 15 lists, but then prioritizing where it's the most important. So you spend, so much of your time sleeping. So maybe you avoid a mattress with flame retardants, or, you are meal prepping your food and you have to heat it up at work. So, like you said, you choose a glass Tupperware instead of the plastic. So, it's these little everyday decisions that you're making. Another example for me is our lawn right now is just completely like sand. So, we have to add dirt and then we have to add seed. And basically every single seed you're gonna find in the store is already coated with the pesticides, and you have to, like, search far and wide to find a seed that's not, and of course, it's, like, triple the price. So there's so many things, and somebody really can't blame themselves when they're dealing with all of these health issues, whether they have chronic illness or infertility or even just hormonal imbalances, because we've just been exposed to these things and there's really no warning. There's been no warning for us throughout our lives, and it's only now that people like you and the woman that inspired you to write your book and stuff that have raised the red flag to help alert people. And so it's very frustrating for people, and I sympathize with them. Especially this experience I just had, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's great what you guys are doing because not everyone can be a toxicologist and not everyone has the time to look into this. So you're making the effort to find out the information, disseminate it to people who don't have the time, and that's great. I wouldn't encourage people to rip out their flooring.
Right.
So what you can do if you have new construction like you do is you can air the house out really well and most of that volatilization of the chemicals that happens shortly after the application. A good example to think about would be a shower curtain. So, you know that smell when you put in a shower curtain, and that smell, you're actually smelling the vinyl chloride volatilizing from the shower curtain, which is bad. It's toxic. And so, like we use cloth shower curtains in our house, not the vinyl chloride shower curtains. The shower curtain loses something like half of its mass to volatilizing those chemicals during its lifetime. And when you smell it, when it's new, that's when most of it is coming off. Or you buy the new car, that new car smell, that's not good. That's formaldehyde, that's volatile organic chemicals that are coming off the car. But if you let it air out, most of it will be gone and it'll be safe after that ventilation has occurred.
Yeah. Yeah, I've learned a lot in this process and basically the same conclusions that you've come to. But yeah, it's really about prioritizing those areas that you spend the most amount of your time in. And for the vinyl flooring, for example, the house unfortunately used like this sheet vinyl, which is worse than just doing the planks because some of the planks can have like no VOCs. And so, yeah, don't necessarily just go and tear everything out because you could be exposing yourself to things underneath that or carpet. A good example, all the stuff is just going to go into the air and now you're breathing this in. But really, just slowly over time, maybe putting things on top or prioritizing different shifts to change in your life, in your house, but also your lifestyle, your diet, your nutrition. So,
Yeah, and you asked
I,
about a toddler or children before, and a toddler is a good example
yeah,
of this because they're on the ground all the time. They're putting things in their mouth. And so
yeah,
that's an age where it's particularly important that the flooring is not full of flame retardant chemicals and
yeah,
PFAS and things like that. So having a natural flooring for the toddler. So we can think about each stage, pregnancy, early childhood, and so on. Each stage, what are the things that we can do to reduce exposures and think about the life history of that individual, that toddler's on the ground all the time and putting things in its mouth.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I mean, just plastics in general, like maybe some of the older school toys that aren't literally just plastic. So, yeah, there's little things like that, but it's so hard when what's flashy and new is probably the most toxic option out there.
So I think so the name of your book is The Chemical Age, and I feel like that could almost be we could also say, okay, the chemical age has led to the estrogenic age, where we're swimming in estrogen kind of everywhere we go. Like I, I don't want to say these things to make people fearful. I want to say these things to empower people to actually make small tweaks in their day to day. And then, hey, maybe we can all talk about these things more to help produce more entrepreneurs who are going to make companies that lead to solutions for us, right? So we don't want to talk about this to elicit fear. I don't want anyone to have a fear-based mindset. Let's all take an empowerment mindset. And I really believe that in order to have that full empowerment, we have to understand the history. And if we can touch on the history briefly of how we got to this place, because I think that the better we understand that, the better decisions we can make trying to come out of this chemical age. Because we like to say that we should learn from history, but sometimes I just don't know if we're learning. But I didn't know about any of these things until I read your book because a lot of us just we were born into the chemical age. We don't know anything else. Whereas your grandpa, for example, was born in the late the 1800s. None of this existed. It's all relatively new, but it's our quote normal. It doesn't have to be this way, and we need to create a larger collective of people who understand how we got here so that we can all work together to get out. So I wrote down like an outline of how we got here. Famine and plagues, wartime chemicals, chemical dependent agriculture to let's use it for everything. So can you I know that this is a big ask, but could you try to outline how we got to this stage of chemical dependence? And I wrote down some important points that got from your book, but that's a big
Sure,
ask.
I'm happy to. And first, I'll just mention what you're talking about is a shifting baseline, right? So my baseline, I was born in 1967, is different from your baseline. You're a generation younger, and so what you grew up with is different than what I grew up with. In some ways, it's better. So, for example, in the 1960s, when I was born, the average breast milk of women in the United States had 4 times higher levels of DDT than was allowed in store-bought cow's milk. That's how bad it got with DDT
And
when I was young.
DDT is a pesticide.
DDT is a pesticide, it's an insecticide, and it became the most widely used pesticide during the 1950s and 1960s. And we banned it domestically except for certain uses in 1972. And then it was internationally banned by the Stockholm Convention in 2001, except for it can be used for malaria, to combat malaria, because it kills the Anopheles mosquito. So, but the idea here is that you were just saying that what you grew up with, what you're used to, it has is during that chemical age, and that's exactly right. And the problems have shifted over time. So, I guess one way to answer your question would be to say that we got into this mess for important reasons that were right at the time. So we had a lot of people dying of famine. We talked about the Irish Potato Famine. Over 1 million Irish people died in that famine. And had copper sulfate been available, nobody would have died. That was unfortunately discovered 20 years too late. That became the first commercial pesticide. It was a pesticide is means a chemical designed to kill pests. So it could be an insecticide, a fungicide, a rodenticide, a
Herbicide.
herbicide, etc. So that became the first one, and that was in the 1860s. 1870s, it became commercialized. Between then and World War II, we almost entirely relied on metal and metalloid based pesticides. So, pesticides containing mercury, lead, arsenic, copper, manganese, cadmium. And the problem with that is some of those were really toxic. So, let's take lead as an example. Lead was used a lot as an insecticide and a fungicide. And so it was used in apple orchards. And prior to the 1930s, we had regulations about interstate commerce in the United States with crops, but not within state commerce. So a farmer could use lead arsenate, so lead plus arsenic, to combat fungi, molds and insects in their apple orchard, and then not clean the crop. Someone could eat that apple at the local market and die from it or get poison from it. And that was happening a lot. And so during World War II, two major categories of insecticides were discovered. One were the organochlorine pest insecticides, and this is DDT is the classic example of that. And the other were the organophosphate insecticides. And the organochlorines were used then during the war in an important way to combat yellow fever and malaria and typhus. And actually, when the United States Army went into Naples in 1944 in combating the Nazis, January 1944, we used DDT to stop a typhus outbreak. And it was the first time in human history that a typhus outbreak had been stopped, which is amazing because typhus, when it starts an epidemic of typhus, mortality rates can be 70%. We just went through the COVID epidemic and it seemed like a big deal, and it was, but the mortality rate was less than 1%. Imagine 70% mortality. So that's what typhus can do, and it's vectored by the body louse. So these chemicals had a really important place in combating famine and combating zoonotic diseases. Most human diseases are carried by animal vectors. And so if we kill the vector, we can stop the disease. So yeah.
Real quick,
Yeah.
the reason that we were seeing so many of those diseases during the war, was that because of cramming a bunch of soldiers into tight areas, living next to each other, exchanging bodily conditions? So what was the reason for all these outbreaks happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for typhus, that's exactly what it is, that the body louse flourishes in crowded, dirty conditions. So if we take the case of Naples, tens of thousands of people were hiding together in underground caves, caverns, and so on. And they had no access to clean themselves and pour food. And so they're both hungry and dirty and lots of body lice. And so the disease ripped through that population. And with malaria and yellow fever, same kind of thing. All diseases are density dependent. The more dense people are, the more quickly they can spread. So think about if you, say, live on a farm, you probably very rarely get a cold. But the moment you move into that college dormitory, you're getting sick all the time. And that's because the diseases are density dependent. So yes, that is why, and those vectors are carrying it. So we had good motivation to use these chemicals to stop famine and to combat these deadly diseases. If you go back to our ancestors, say born in the 1850s, they could expect to lose about half of their children during childhood. They would die, and they would die of these diseases. So imagine what it's like. You're raising a family. Like I have 3 kids. Can you imagine thinking I'm going to lose half of my kids on average? It's just horrible. It would affect your dynamics with your kids. It would affect your outlook on life. So these chemicals have actually given us this incredibly positive thing. We can raise children now and have a very good chance that they all have long, healthy lives. That's the positive side. The negative side, and there's a history with the chemical weapons, which I can touch on briefly, which is many of these chemicals either started as chemical weapons and then were developed into pesticides, or they started as pesticides and then were developed into chemical weapons. So that whole history is
Wait,
fascinating.
Pat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then what happened is after the war, instead of just using these chemicals like DDT for public health, we started using it everywhere. So DDT was in wallpaper for the children's nursery, so your baby wouldn't have to have flies on the wall. It was sprayed on airplanes so that you wouldn't be bothered by a bug while you're on the airplane. It was put into paint so you wouldn't have flies landing on your house. It was everywhere. And, the trucks would go through and fumigate neighborhoods so we wouldn't have flies. So this all started in 1945. The very first use for non-military purposes was in August 1945 at Jones Beach in New York. And then it became used everywhere. And by 1952, the insects that we use DDT against had already evolved resistance to it, which gets to that other point that the problem with overuse, whether it's for nuisances like DDT was used or agriculture or whatever, is that the pests will very quickly evolve resistance. The chemical will become ineffective. We have to use a higher volume of it and develop new chemicals. So we eventually switched to the organophosphate chemicals because of the environmental problems with DDT and its relatives. They were leading to the loss and extinction of birds and other wildlife around the world because they're so persistent in the environment and they're endocrine disruptors and et cetera. So we switched to the organophosphates. Organophosphates break down much quicker in the environment. Within a couple of weeks, usually they've broken down. They're no longer a problem, but they're much more toxic. So we shifted the burden from the consumer eating foods that have pesticide residues, organochlorines, to the farm worker who's now spraying something that's much more toxic. It wasn't that dangerous to apply the organochlorines, very dangerous to apply the organophosphates. So anyway, there's been these shifts over time and we moved on to carbamates. We moved on now. We mostly use neonicotinoids, which are nicotine mimics as insecticides. So there's all these different classes. We're constantly shifting, constantly increasing the volume, constantly making new chemicals.
Huh. Sounds like a great business model to be in the chemical industry. Like chemical companies, you guys have got it. You've got a sustained business model. You're always needed. You're always needed for more and always needed for new. A few things that I wrote down from your book that I really took as main takeaways is a lot of these chemicals originated during the war because we shifted from like combat wars to just straight chemical wars. And we put so much money, so much effort into developing these compounds. I took one quote from your book, quote, 1/3 of the 17,000 chemists in the United States worked for the federal government on the war effort. The research arm of this expertise included 1,700 scientists, which was the greatest research group that the United States had ever assembled. So we put so much effort. And then now imagine these huge manufacturing plants that were used for wartime. What do we do with them now? So you talked about this thing called the Chemical Warfare Service. It was this group. They rebranded themselves after the war as, quote, Chemical Peace Service, conducting, quote, peaceful warfare against crop pests. And so I think my biggest takeaway from your book was, hey, we had to do something with what we developed during the war. And unfortunately, we overused it, we abused it, and now we're kind of reaping the consequences of that.
That's exactly right. And we could use DDT as an example of this because if we had only just used DDT for medical emergencies like an outbreak of typhus, an outbreak of malaria, an outbreak of yellow fever, it would still be effective today. It would be an awesome tool to have today. But because we overused it, it became useless. And at the same time, we contaminated the environment, harmed human health, and so on. So that's exactly what happened. So the federal government had this chemical warfare service. They needed something to do to justify their existence after the war. So they did that rebranding and they helped turn these chemical plants that had been churning out chemical weapons into chemical plants that are making pesticides and other chemicals using the same technology.
it, so you brought up like, okay, we went from DDT. What classification is that?
Organochlorine.
Organochlorine to organophosphates to
Yeah,
how
so
do
we
you say it?
use so after organophosphates, we also use another class called carbamates. Now the main insecticides are the neonicotinoids. So it's actually quite interesting historically because one of the very first pesticides ever used was nicotine, natural nicotine, and it's been used for centuries as an insecticide. So people had known for a long time that nicotine is an effective insecticide, but it's very difficult to synthesize. And so finally, organic chemists figured out how to make it in the lab. Once you can make it in the lab, then you can make it at huge volumes. And it has some advantages. So one advantage so neo means new, so it's new nicotines, basically, neonicotinoids. One of the advantages of them is they have low mammalian toxicity. And so they're not very toxic to people. And that's great. But a problem then is they're very toxic to insects. Most insects are beneficial. So when we use these chemicals, we not only kill the pest insects, we kill the insects and the spiders and the mites and so on that would consume or parasitize those insects. So we wipe out the arachnids, all the spiders that would normally eat them. We wipe out the birds because birds are very sensitive to neonicotinoids. We wipe out the birds that would normally eat the pest insects. We wipe out the parasitic wasps. So we essentially eliminate the biological controls that are there naturally. And by doing that, we have to use even more of the chemicals. So the chemical companies, of course, can make more money.
Is glyphosate one of these?
Yeah, so glyphosate is a herbicide, but it's a different category of pesticides. It's one of the most widely used in the world, and it's also called Roundup. So the glyphosate is the chemical name. It's also quite toxic to wildlife. It disrupts sexual development, and in most European countries, it's been banned. Um, we're usually behind in the United States ever since the mid 1970s. We've been behind on regulation of chemicals from Europe, but it is one of the problematic chemicals, especially in the volumes that it's used.
And I think the one thing that I've learned a lot about glyphosate is it targets I always mispronounce it, shikimate pathway, shikimate, Shikmate.
I'm not sure.
Okay, it targets some pathway in like bugs and microorganisms that are not in human cells, but we have more microbe cells than human cells in our body. And so glyphosate is causing gut problems a lot because we're wiping out some of the beneficial gut microbes that are helping create a healthy balance in our gut. But this whole thing shifting from one group to the next group to the next group is called regrettable replacement. We make something, oh, oops, make something else that maybe solves what that problem was, but oops, now there's a new one. Oops, here's another new one. And it just like goes on in how
Well,
how
that goes back to what we were talking about just a little bit ago, like the burden to show that these are harmful for us and the environment is kind of placed back on the population, us. Can you briefly talk about what is going on there, what we can do about it, and what is being done about it?
Sure, and also just to address Ashley's question about the microbiome, that is a very important aspect of it. So a lot of these chemicals, we talked about endocrine disruption as a mechanism, but another mechanism of toxicity is actually impacting the microbiome, and it's not just the gut microbiome, right? There's a vaginal microbiome, there's skin microbiome, there's oral microbiome, there's a lot, and it's probably double the number of cells as the human cells in the body. So that's an important part of it. And even if we think about going back to the question of reproduction and reproductive problems, one of the things that can interfere with reproduction is um, dysgenesis or alteration of the vaginal microbiome. So that'd be the female specific example of that. But you also talked about regenerative agricultural, and the soil microbiome is super important. And we also can destroy that with these chemicals. So that these are, and there are many different things going on that can impact it. But going back to the question about why it is that the burden of proof is on us. So it used to be that pharmaceutical companies could make a drug and market it with no testing whatsoever, and people were dying because lots of stuff is poisonous. And so about 110 years ago, we started what became the FDA and the whole process by which drugs had to go through a rigorous testing process to be able to go on the market, including animal studies and then clinical trials in different phases to prove that they're both efficacious and that they don't have serious side effects. And there were some disasters after the FDA, but not that many. Thalidomide is an important example of a disaster after actually it was stopped in the US by the FDA, and other countries didn't have it and they had birth defects from thalidomide. So in drugs, we have this relatively effective mechanism to prevent dangerous drugs from going on the market. With pesticides, there are regulations around the testing of pesticides, but those regulations include the economic benefit in addition to any potential environmental costs. And so once you get through that process, we still have a lot of dangerous pesticides out there. I'll just give you an example. I do a lot of work in Yuma County on the Arizona-Mexico border. There are about 230 pesticides in use in Yuma County. A quarter of them are considered hazardous, meaning either they're carcinogenic or endocrine disruptor, developmental disruptor chemicals. So even though we know that they're hazardous, we use them at huge volumes because the economic benefit is there. So that the process with pesticides is completely inadequate because we still get through lots of chemicals that are dangerous. And then once you leave pesticides, if you're talking about personal care products, if you're talking about household cleaners, if you're talking about stuff you put in furniture, et cetera, there's no requirement of safety. So you can put whatever you want out there. And that's why we're getting something like 10,000 new chemicals a year. There are some groups that are trying very hard to work with industry to solve this. So, for example, there's a NGO called the Green Science Policy Institute that works with scientists like me and with industry that wants to make their industry cleaner, to come together and figure out how can we get rid of dangerous classes of chemicals in your products and give something that would solve the same purpose without that. So a lot of companies are participating in this now, and they're really trying to improve what they're doing, and that's very important. But we need really every company to do that, and we also need legislation whereby chemical companies have to prove something's non-toxic before it comes on the market.
Yeah, would this be an example of that? Like if you were looking for a sofa and it was Green Guard certified, is that coming from that effort?
So yeah, the Green Science Policy Institute is one of these groups that does it. They're not the only one. So there are different
Okay.
groups that have certifications that they will do around like Environmental Working Group does a lot of this kind of work. There are others. So
Okay.
but yes, these are really important. I mean, just think back um, to an example from the 1980s when the Environmental Working Group, I think it was, worked with McDonald's to get them to replace their styrofoam containers with paper wrappers for their sandwiches. And they're selling billions of burgers and sandwiches a year. The styrofoam that they were using had chlorofluorocarbons in it, which was destroying the stratospheric ozone layer of all of us. The whole planet was threatened by this. And so just by getting one big company to change what they were doing and then other companies followed, it had a massive impact on reducing that pollution in the environment. So that's the kind of thing that we
Yeah.
really need. We need to be working the scientists with policy people with industry to solve these problems.
Yeah. Again, back to my home process. In looking for new furniture, I started to see a little bit of that, like on larger websites like Crate and Barrel, they'll have sections of their site that are the Green Guard certified, and that's really awesome to see because, like you said, hopefully other smaller companies or other larger companies pick up on that and see that that is what people are demanding, but it does really start from us, of course, these items can be really expensive, but yeah, prioritizing certain items in your house to make safer, maybe like for your infant, like you said, can be such a huge step, not only for your health and safety, but like you said, making this a larger societal impact.
I I think the one thing that one of the main things I want someone to take away from what we've talked about so far is, like, we do have a say, and it is important to raise awareness ground up because of how big some of these big ag and big chemical companies are and how much lobbying power they have. And unless we share our thoughts and opinions, they're gonna continue to dominate the food system. They're gonna continue to dominate the chemical system because of just their sheer size. Remember I told you about that example in the EPA where they started this test or this, like, quest to classify different pesticides based on their endocrine disruption. 30 years later, nothing has been done. 30 years. 30 years, the EPA. I read a report from the Inspector General of the EPA that came out in 2021, and it said there was, like, 2 people on staff, very much underfunded. The staff members were basically told to think that this just doesn't even exist, and so, like, there was nothing was carried through in testing the endocrine disruption of the pesticides in use, and this was a government, uh, project, but due to so much lobbying, it was kind of halted in its track. But we kind of need to, like, overpower that really large megaphone of the lobbying industries that are going into politicians' heads, and we need to raise awareness from the ground up of what we want, because at the end of the day, as consumers, we can help shift the demand of, "Hey, supplier, I want this, so change your supply."
Yeah, that's right. So one of the major points in Silent Spring, Richard Carson wrote about the right to know because it was impossible to know what people were spraying. Um, so, for example, the government would have plane loads go over urban areas and drop DDT to kill mosquitoes or whatever. And not only could you not stop it, but you couldn't even know what they were dropping on you. And so some of the legislation that happened after that had to do with the right to know. So now someone's going to spray, they're supposed to put up a notice says, I'm going to spray such and such. That's helpful, right? But it's not, it's a small part of what's needed. And I think the problem you're talking about with the EPA and these other regulators is there's a lot of industry capture where these people will go from, say, a regulatory job in government to then work at a chemical company. And that's the transition that they want to make. They can make a lot of money. And so when they're in,
Revolving door.
yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot of terrific scientists and regulators at EPA. I know many of them. They're working very hard. They're trying to do the right thing, but the political obstacles are just enormous. And it's not even, many people might say this is a Republican issue. No, it's actually in both parties. You see this happening in states like California that are controlled by Democrats. You see it happening across the country when it's under control of both parties. I can give you another example. I started working on perchlorate, which is this common water contaminant. It's the oxidizer of solid rocket propellant, artillery, fireworks, road flares, things like that. And I started working on perchlorate in 2002. And at that time, there was a big debate about we need to regulate this federally, that it's toxic at low part per billion concentration. It's a thyroid disrupting chemical. We've talked a lot about estrogenic chemicals, but the second most common avenue of endocrine disruption is thyroid disruption of thyroid hormones. And under the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, they decided not to regulate it because of pressure from the military, because the military could potentially be liable for billions of dollars of cleanup. Then when Obama became president, they said this was the first chemical they were going to regulate it. They never did. 8 years in power, never regulated it. And then all subsequent administrations did not regulate. So it's regulated to some extent in about 22 states by state legislation, but it's not federally regulated. And we've known for 30 years that it's toxic at low concentrations. That's just one example. I could give you thousands like that. It's really a big problem.
Wow. Oh gosh. Well, so I know on I think it's the EPA, you can search what you might be exposed to in your water. Is that would pop up on somebody's search for their zip code if it was there?
So perchlorate is tested in some areas where it's known to be in the drinking water. Like if you live in California, it would be on your monthly water bill what the concentration of perchlorate is in your water, or if it's not on your bill, you could look it up with the utility. They have those data because they test there regularly. Like I live in Arizona, it's not tested in our drinking water, so we don't know unless we get it tested. It's not part of the government testing, so it depends on what state you're in. If you're in Massachusetts, you could look it up. Depends on what state you're in.
Oh, that's very scary.
Does a carbon filter remove that from the water?
No, perchlorate's hard to remove from the water. There are ways to do it, but it's not removed by an activated carbon filter. But carbon filters are really effective at lots of chemicals, and moving to bottled water is not the solution for any of these things that we're talking about, because that water is just sourced from other places that might have all the same stuff in it. Plus, you're getting the chemicals from the plastic that's in the water, and there's also a huge environmental cost to the plastic. So, really, the solution, if you have impaired water quality in your home, is to install a water filter. And if you can afford it, the best one is to put in an RO, reverse osmosis filter for your drinking water, and then you just replace the filters every, I don't know, 6 months or so.
Would that get rid of the specific one you're talking about,
It
RO?
it would remove it would remove the perchlorate, I'm pretty sure, down to a level of no concern, and it would also remove most of the contaminants of concern that we have in our drinking water.
We've kind of gone off on a tangent on this one, but I have a few more questions because this is fascinating. So you mentioned in California it's tested, in Arizona it's not. Is this because there's known usage in certain areas, or like who and where should be a little bit more aware of this?
Yeah, so I was just using perchlorate as an example because there are many I could do to other examples, but we have a lot of perchlorate contamination in Arizona, but it's not regulated by the state of Arizona, so we don't have the information on the concentrations. Whereas California has the strictest regulations in the country about perchlorate, and so they are testing it in California.
Oh, okay.
So I think it would be useful if you are concerned about your water. We did an episode a bit ago how some people may not do well with reverse osmosis water because it's so demineralized, it's unstructured, and people saw benefits in their health switching from RO water to spring water. because it had some minerals and it is structured water. And so I think someone should test their water before making a big jump like that, because you may have perfectly fine water. I know I heard in a podcast that you were on that you were saying that I didn't know was New York actually has great water
Yeah.
because it comes from a natural spring up there. So I don't think everyone should freak out about it.
No, I'm really glad you said that. So the reason that I have RO filter in my home is that Tucson drinking water has some problematic chemicals in it. And so our water, we get it, it's a combination of water that's groundwater and then water that's coming from this canal system from the Colorado River. So we know that there are problems with that water. And so it's a city where having an in-home water filter is a good idea. But I'm
Mhm.
from Alaska. We never had a water filter in Alaska. We had really good water there. And many parts of the country have excellent water. And then you're better off not having a filter, just like you're
Right.
saying.
Um, so on the topic of water while we're here, are there so I know you can look up what's in your water and maybe you can if you have a well, but you can get it tested. Are there any top offenders that you would encourage somebody to start filtering their water if these popped up? Because I know there's just an aggressively large list of things that could be in there and maybe like 4 or 5 things pop up, but are there any that are in particular extremely important to filter?
Yeah, so one example would be arsenic. And arsenic is naturally occurring, plus it's used in many industrial applications, including in pesticides historically. And arsenic is a metalloid, is a metal-like element, and it causes cancer. And so that's an important one not to have in your drinking water. And there are areas of the United States and other parts of the world that have naturally high levels of arsenic. So parts of Arizona, for example, parts of Alaska, parts of Mexico, Bangladesh, parts of India. So it depends on where you live, but some areas just have high levels. And the water quality standard for arsenic is 10 parts per billion. So you want to have water that's lower than 10. And so if your water's higher than that, you would want to filter for arsenic. And there are a couple of ways to do that, but one would be RO water. And so that's one for sure. I would check arsenic. So like I grew up on well water in Alaska. We didn't test our water, but we should have if we had the ability to, because there are places in Alaska with high arsenic. Some parts of the country, like in Arizona, we also have some other metals that are problematic in water. And so normally those metals are a single panel. You can get tested and you get all the metals back, and you would know whether you need a filter for that. Some parts of the country now are showing high levels of PFAS. So these are the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So, for example, in the Carolinas, there was a company that dumped it for decades, and there's been some high levels there. Other parts of the country experiencing similar issues. So, if you happen to be, you can Google it and see if you're in an area with high PFAS. If you are, those are probably getting tested already, and you could see if the water is high in those. And so, those would be some examples of perchlorate. Another one, California, Texas, any place, some of the East Coast states, any place with an aerospace industry, um, would be Arizona would be another one. Be good to know what your perchlorate levels are,
Okay, so
Perchlorate.
perchlorate, arsenic, and PFAS. I
and
just
also other metals. Looking at
metals.
lead, manganese, other elements that can be high in water.
I do know that some people just choose to avoid this and go with spring water in glass, but I know that that's not a financially reasonable option for many people. And so I think that if someone is concerned, find out as much information as you can about your water or get it tested, because I think that seeing tests, seeing data is one of the best ways to be empowered and not live in a state of fear and what if.
Yeah. Well, last question on the water. So,
She really likes the water.
well, I if you look up in Three Rivers where I'm at, the highest one that comes up is arsenic. So, if somebody is going to get a filter for their house, and let's say there are whole home filters and there's drinking water filters, is it crucial to do the whole home or is it most important to just do the drinking water?
Just the drinking water. You're not going to be harmed by those levels of arsenic in a shower or anything like that. It's going to be the drinking water. So there's no reason to have the extra expense for the other uses. And just because water's from a spring does not mean that it's okay, right? If that spring has naturally high levels of arsenic, that it's not okay. Most water in the United States is good. Most water is, you don't need to filter the vast majority of the water in the United States. It's just certain parts of the country have problematic drinking water. And, we're very lucky in this country because our drinking water is free of pathogenic microbes. And I do a lot of work in developing countries like in Guatemala, where I work at any given time, about a third of the children have diarrheal diseases. They have high infant mortality. They have impaired growth, and that's coming primarily from pathogenic microbes, so bacteria, viruses, and amoeboid organisms that are in their drinking water. So we are super lucky here and in Europe and in other modern economies that our drinking water is safe to drink. So what we're talking about here is kind of the luxury of, okay, how do we make our water even better by lowering the levels of these chemicals? But we have to really think back and reflect again. Like, think about losing half of your kids. That's what happens when you have really poor water. We're not in that situation in the United States. Our water is excellent, but we have some problems that we should address.
Most certainly. I'm so glad you said that. This is definitely a first world problem. And that what you just said encourages people to take a step back and think about the bigger picture. There's so many things you can do to improve your health, and you don't have to do every single one of them perfectly in order to be healthy.
And I never buy bottled water. So, except for if I'm in one of those countries with pathogenic microbes in the water, but in the United States, never. It's bad for the environment and it's not good for your health either. So the tap water everywhere in the country is good to drink, but if it's your home where you're drinking it all the time and you're making food from it, and you know that you have problematic water like parts of Tucson, then putting in an in-home drinking water filter is a good idea.
Okay. Good
So,
advice.
Frank, our population is still growing and we still need to feed everyone. So someone may come out of this conversation and say, "Well, we have to use pesticides now. We have to use chemicals in order to produce enough food." But I disagree. I think that there are other options. I think that we're just born into the current industrial agriculture system and it's all we know and it's all we're used to because we're at this age now where 70% of the current farmers are age 70 and above. And they just, and I'm not like saying anything bad about them, but they have done things just business as usual. That's what we've always done. But it was that era. Now we're entering this next generation is a little bit more like, hey, wait, we don't want to use these things. We don't want to be exposed to these things. There's this increased interest in regenerative agriculture, permaculture, all these other practices. So what is you've mentioned this term called integrated pest management for the potential solution in producing enough food in a way that doesn't make us reliant on these chemicals that are causing gut problems, hormone disruption. So what in your view, what is and also your understanding of how we got to this place through wartime efforts, what is the steps out? How do we get out of this chemical dependence and still produce enough food?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because I think it's absolutely essential, not only for the future of human health, but for the future of the planet, the biodiversity of our planet, because we're degrading our environment. That we shift to using integrative pest management as our universal solution to growing food. Of course, we have to grow enough food for the population, and so I think that's the best way to do it. We can grow a lot of things without pesticides at all, organic agriculture, but at scale right now, some pesticides are needed. And what is done with integrated pest management is when there's a pest outbreak, there's a spot treatment at that very precise location to prevent it from growing. But most of the pest control is happening by having diverse crops, so no monocultures where you're just setting out this massive feast for the pests. By having healthy soils, you talked about the microbiome of the soil. That's hugely important for having healthy crops and high productivity. By having natural pest control, so having healthy populations of birds and bats and parasitoid wasps and spiders and all these other things that control the pest, and then by using technology to make the chemical use as minimal as possible. So let's give you an example. There's an Israeli company that recently developed a sensor that they put on date palms, and as soon as insects land on the palm to eat the date fruit, it triggers the sensor that goes to a signal on the smartphone. So the farmer can go out and he can spray something that's just this tiny part of one tree to prevent the plantation from being infested by the pests. So you end up using maybe 1/1000th the amount of chemicals that you would otherwise for that. So there is a little bit of use of chemicals, but very minimal. And so that's essentially what integrated pest management is. There's more to it than that, but it's essentially a diversified approach, diversified crops, healthy soils, making sure you're rotating the crops to allow the nutrients to accumulate properly, not relying on fertilizers either, because the overuse of fertilizers is also very damaging to the environment. And so all of these things go in together to have a solution in agriculture that's at scale to feed the planet, but not using these chemicals, using them at a very small amount.
I think about this all the time because we grew up in Illinois, and I used to think farming was rows of corn stalks because that's all I knew. That's like, wow, look at how perfect that line is. This whole field of corn, how beautiful it is. Nature doesn't work like that. And I think that that's something that people don't realize. Mother Nature thrives with diversity. It's symbiotic, where it's not 1+1 = 2, it's 1+1 = 1,000. And so the more biodiversity we give Mother Nature, the better she works with us and the less chemicals we have to use to fight against her. And so I think about this as I drive past cornfields. I'm like, huh, that pasture should be used for beef cattle for some part of the year. And then we can do a few different companion plants during the growing season. And I think that we can just get a lot more creative with how we use pastures. There's so much lost potential out in the fields that right now they're being so much used for corn, soy, these monocultures, but we could maybe try to stack a few enterprises on farms and introduce companion plants. So like in the garden, I just learned that um, plant the three sisters. So this beautiful Native American practice where they would grow corn, beans, and squash together because they all help support each other, provide natural pest resistance. I think that our ancestors knew a lot more than what we give them in terms of producing food. And so bringing back these like unique features of biology that we've ignored as we've entered this chemical age. And it's not to the interest of chemical companies. And I think that that's going to be one of the biggest obstacles in working towards this integrated pest management system and regenerative agriculture and non-monoculture is it's going to be less and less reliance on these chemicals. And so I think that the one of the biggest challenges we face is going to be that lobbying power of the big ag companies.
For sure. And if we think about our industrial agriculture, it is a failure. It's a success in terms of food is abundant and cheap, but it's a failure because it wipes out the natural controls of pests. It's wiping out the birds, it's wiping out the spiders, the insects that parasitize or eat other insects. And they, under normal circumstances, would control almost all the pests. And so that's why the IPM would only need to use a little bit of chemicals because it's just when you have a little outbreak here, a little outbreak there that's managing to get through that you would use it. Um, I think when you were talking, it reminded me of some farms that I've visited in the tropical rainforest where they've maintained the tropical rainforest, but they're growing coffee in the shade of the rainforest trees. They're harvesting some of the naturally occurring fruits and nuts of the rainforest trees. And there's no pest problems because it's such a diverse ecosystem that the pests that come in there to eat the coffee are getting wiped out by the naturally occurring animals that live there. So that's really an example of what we can do, and or the beautiful example you gave of indigenous growing of crops and having diverse agriculture. If you think about it, before the industrial agriculture, all societies on the planet had to do things like that. And they figured it out by doing it. So they figured out, oh, if I grow these three things together and I leave this field fallow for this long, this often, I'll have enough food. And so part of it too is getting that knowledge back that people used to have, but they've lost it because you don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
So I would also argue industrial agricultural is failing with in terms of soil microbiome, soil health, biodiversity. it's also not working for human health. We're actually living fewer years. Our life expectancy is going down. Obesity rates are on the rise. Chronic disease development is on the rise. Um, Infertility and all of these gut problems that we're seeing, food sensitivities, something's not adding up. It's not ideal. And I don't think we're facing that reality right now.
Exactly. You just brought up another important category of what chemicals do, which is obesity. So when you hear public health officials talk about obesity, they always talk about, let me back up. If you go back to my childhood, we would have maybe one overweight kid in a school, and now it's 60%. And so something's happened. That's in my lifetime. So the public health officials who study this, they all say, well, we have a more sedentary lifestyle, which is true, and people are eating more of the bad foods that lead to greater obesity. That's true. But what they ignore is the chemical contribution, because a lot of the chemicals we're exposed to disrupt the metabolic system. They're obesogenic chemicals. And a good deal of this obesity epidemic is caused by chemical exposures, by these synthetic chemicals, pesticides, but also many of the in-home chemicals that we use. And I just find it ignored and ignored and ignored by the science journalists, by the public health officials. They're not paying attention to it, even though there's a lot of good research on this.
Have you heard of Dr. John Speakman?
No.
He's a metabolism researcher in China, and he came out with this incredible paper in 2023, and he showed the data that we are actually more active than we were in the 1990s. Our AEE, activity energy expenditure, so the calories we burn by moving, is higher, but our basal metabolic rates, the calories that we burn just sitting here, has declined by 200 to 300 calories per person. And he makes the claim that that is enough to explain the obesity epidemic. And so we have to start thinking, what are we doing to downregulate our metabolisms, our basal metabolic rates, that is contributing to the obesity epidemic? Because even if we kept our calories the same, if we're expending less calories by just sitting here, that's going to lead to weight gain. And so like you're saying, hey, these chemicals, these pesticides, they're interfering with our metabolism and these hormones that are important for proper energy production. And why aren't those things talked about? Like, this was a huge paper, 2023, published in Nature, but no one's discussing it here in 2025.
Right. And you're bringing up a lot of good examples of things that have changed in public health. So we have more obesity, we have more autism, we have um, lower fertility in both men and women. Um, we have higher rates of hormone mediated cancers. And a common thread to all of these are the chemicals that we're exposed to. We have more diabetes, and diabetes is also can be caused by these chemical exposures. So chemicals are playing, they're not the only cause, but chemicals are playing an important and underappreciated role in all of these public health challenges, including autism. So there's good research on this using animal models showing that rodents can develop autism-like behavior when they're exposed to these kinds of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the womb. And there's also epidemiological evidence in humans that the increase in autism is in part due to these chemical exposures. So we have a lot of public health challenges for which the chemical component of it is essentially being ignored.
Yeah, just as you said, it's not the only thing. We did a podcast recently on breast milk, and there is an interesting association between autism in children and delayed, you know, growth with the increase in our consumption of PUFAs, so like in vegetable oils. So I think it's all contributing on the same level within the body and disrupting the hormones, disrupting the metabolism, and it's all compounding on each other, and that's why we're seeing just such mass issues in society.
Like you said, it's shifting the baseline, the norm from one generation to the next.
Yeah, so processed food, essentially all laced with vegetable oils. Obviously, there's other issues with it too, but that's something to consider for somebody as well.
Can you imagine what a shock it would be if someone in the 1970s, when I was in elementary school, uh, stepped through a doorway and they arrived in 2025 in that same classroom,
Yeah,
and you're seeing 60% obesity in the children as opposed to maybe one kid who's a little bit overweight in the
yeah,
classroom. It's a shocker, but because it happened gradually, we don't really think about it. And the same for the autism, the same for the other metabolic disorders, the diabetes, for these estrogen-mediated cancers. They're all getting worse. And what's the one thing that has been consistently occurring across this time? It's been more and more use of chemicals. So the volume, the number, all of that constantly increasing.
Well, you said that the US is a little behind European countries in the regulation of this, and I recently went on my honeymoon with, my husband Brandon, and we went to Italy, and the most shocking thing about being there, the little province that I was in, was that people were literally not overweight. They were just not. They were, walking around their little markets, and they were riding their bikes.
Can I say something real quick though? The
Yeah.
reason that she chose this place in Italy is because it's well known that they cook in butter. That's a huge thing we talk about on our channel is like traditional animal fats, like what our great great grandma would
Well,
eat.
I wanted to, experience authentic cuisine, so obviously they've maintained a lot of their ancestors' food. They're well-versed in that, but like you said, possibly there's more to it. There were so many areas that they were just growing their own food. Every yard had a little garden. Every farm looked like it was doing different things, like, back to back, like, there were sheep, there were crops, there were other things. It wasn't cornfield after cornfield, and no yes, there was some people overweight. That's obviously subjective, but there was not an obesity epidemic to the degree that when I simply just got back to the airport in the US, it was like it hit me like a wall. I was like, "Oh my goodness, I'm back home. I feel safe again because this is what I'm used to."
Norm.
And it's sad. I'm laughing, but it's sad. It
Yeah,
really
I'm
is.
glad that you brought up Italy. I think it's a fascinating example. So you have those Mediterranean areas like Italy and Greece where people have the longest lifespan in the world. But also, I love Italy. It's my favorite food in the world. And one of the things that's very interesting about the food in Italy is pretty much wherever you go, if you're in a restaurant or someone's home, what you're eating is locally grown, and it varies from valley to valley, from town to town. The traditions, the food they're growing, all of that. And I have irritable bowel syndrome, and I have to avoid a lot of foods. So I don't eat. I basically avoid gluten unless it's fermented. So I'll eat sourdough bread, but not regular bread. And I have to avoid a lot of fruits and things that have high FODMAP, the sugars that are problematic in them. When I go to Italy, I can eat almost everything, including the breads that I can't eat here. And so part of it is probably also less chemical exposure. They're locally growing the stuff. They're not using as many pesticides. And so I think there's a combination of those factors going on. I kind of experimented with it in Italy because I love the food so much to try things like pasta, which I don't eat here. And I was fine with the pasta
That's
there. So
amazing. Yeah.
so I and I actually have my youngest kid is just finishing high school there, so he's been there for 3
Oh,
years in high
wow.
school, so I have an excuse to go there quite often.
Well, lucky you. So that's awesome, and I experienced a similar situation, so, yeah, I think that's very telling.
So I have this belief that I think a big reason why we're failing so much with health in America is we've completely lost tradition with our food preparation. Like we American food doesn't it's not really rooted in like, you know, sourdough fermentation, soaking and sprouting, long, slow cooking. It's quick, convenient, and cheap. And we've lost touch with like what our ancestors were doing. Whereas like both of you guys experienced in Italy, like this deep rooted tradition that's passed down from one generation to the next. We kind of like don't have that here.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You reminded me of my father who used to bake sourdough bread every day, and sometimes it was amazing and sometimes it's horrible because he put all the leftovers in it, so whatever was left over from the previous dinner would go into it. He would also just go out and collect random things like nettles from the yard and put it in his bread, just all kinds of things. And so it was always an adventure to try his bread. But I grew up eating the sourdough bread, and I I also, I feel very lucky because I grew up in Alaska, which was very clean, very clean water, very clean air, but also we were eating wild caught fish, we were eating wild game, and we had a farm and we were raising our own animals, and it was an organic farm. And so I think that's super lucky, but it's also how everybody would have lived if you go back 100 years. So we do have to try to go back in time and reclaim some of these really valuable things that we've lost.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful takeaway. Yeah.
So I like to end podcast with an interesting question. And you have been all over the world for your research. And I've heard you talk about a number of crazy stories. What is your favorite travel research story where you went to investigate pesticides and their impact on a various community throughout the world?
Well, I don't know if this would be a favorite story, or more like something that I'm really thinking about right now, which is that just last week we published a paper looking at the levels of toxic metals and metalloids in the breast milk of Mayan women in Guatemala. And the reason we've been doing this study is that in Guatemala is the highest rate of stunting. That is the impaired growth, really, really small people, very small children. They have the highest prevalence of stunting in the Western Hemisphere, the sixth highest in the world. And stunting is not just a concern for having short stature, there's also health problems associated with stunting throughout life. So it's always been said that in these poor countries that have high rates of stunting, that the cause is infectious diseases during childhood, which is certainly true, and poor nutrition, which is also true, like not enough food stress, all of that. But even though there have been really major investments in those areas in the last few decades, there has not been a change in the rate of stunting. So we wanted to see whether chemicals might be playing a role in this. And I went down with one of my postdocs, and we measured the levels of these toxic metals and also some pesticides in the breast milk of women who lived in just one watershed where there's high rates of stunting, and we compared communities with high rates to lower rates of stunting, and and we also measured the size of their babies, so we could relate what's in the breast milk to the babies. And we found that higher concentrations of arsenic, barium, beryllium, and lead in the breast milk were associated with more stunting of the babies. We also found a marginal association with one of the breakdown products of DDT. So this is, in a sense, good news because those are all things that can be removed with water filtration. And not only that, but the pathogenic microbes that are also playing a role and also leading to high infant mortality can be removed with water filtration. So the next step is we're trying to get a grant to try out different water filtration techniques and find some that would be affordable in a country with high poverty to effectively remove these dangerous compounds. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I go down to Guatemala a lot. I actually went there for the first time on accident in 1994 because my wife and I were graduate students, and this is well before the internet. And back then, when you wanted to travel, you'd go to as a student, you go to a student travel office, and so we didn't have much money. We said, "What are the cheapest tickets you have to Latin America?" And they were to Ecuador. So we said, "Awesome, we'll buy the tickets to Ecuador." They said, "Well, you get a free stopover somewhere in Central America." So we looked at the map. I'd never been to Guatemala. I didn't know anything about it. So we chose Guatemala. We didn't realize they were in a civil war at the time. So we landed in Guatemala, got off at the airport. We were met by soldiers who handed us a piece of paper saying, "You can go here, you can go here, you can't go anywhere else in the country." And so but we loved it. People are so friendly. It was, they loved having visitors. We've been going back ever since. So over 30 years. And then from there, we went on to Ecuador. We had a wonderful time in Ecuador. And if you have time for just a quick story, I'll tell you we were taking a chicken bus over the Andes to go down to the Amazon, and there was a flash flood in front of our bus that took out the road, almost wiped out our bus, and so we almost got killed in this flash flood. And the bus driver threw on the brakes, and he started backing up as the road was collapsing in front of us, and he got away from the flooding, and then he did one of these 30-point turns to turn around on this dirt road, started going the other way, and then the road collapsed in a mudslide in front of us the other way. So
Oh my
then we were
God.
stuck there. And I asked the bus driver, "What happens now?" And he said, "Well, we wait for someone to dig us out." And I said, "How long will that take?" And he said, "Last time it only took a week." And, people have their pigs and their chickens and stuff with them, and they're obviously used to this kind of thing. But my wife and I decided, no, we're not, this is dangerous. We're not staying here. So we got out of the bus. They tried to stop us. We walked back to where the flash flood was, and the locals had already chopped down a tree. So we were able to cross the tree to get over the ravine, hitchhiked our way down to the Amazon. And all of this is just getting to a interesting anecdote, which is we got down to the Amazon. we had a platform in the rainforest, sleeping under mosquito netting, and in the middle of the night, the net went up, and this monkey, a spider monkey, crawled into our platform, and it just wrapped himself around my wife and nuzzled into her chest and was holding on with all 4 feet and his tail and wouldn't let go of her for 3 days. And
3 days.
she always had said, I don't want children. I never want children. But the moment that monkey wrapped around her, she said, we have to have a kid now, and just activated her hormones. So anyway, that trip got me started on working in Latin America, and also as a parent. I have 3 kids now. They're all grown, but it all started with a spider monkey.
That is that's crazy. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm so glad that happened to you guys. The whole traumatic experience, because now you have your wonderful kids. So
Oh my gosh.
thank you for sharing that.
That's just so much incredible research and
Yeah.
things that you're doing for the world. So, wow. I don't have stories like that in my life.
No, we were sheltered.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And thank you so much for coming on this podcast and sharing your knowledge with us.
I
So
really enjoyed
for
it. Yeah.
anyone listening, definitely check out The Chemical Age. Truthfully, Frank, I think that this is a perfect book for someone doing like homeschooling, because it gives a beautiful story of how we got to this chemical point. Also talks about chemistry a little bit, and it talks about food production and very important moments in history that really changed where we're at today. So for anyone that's looking for a homeschool book, it's advanced reading. It's not like young kids, but I foresee using it for future homeschooling because we want to do that here. But so Chemical Age, and then where else can people read about your work, find out about what you're doing?
Well, I think another good thing would be I have a podcast called the Science History Podcast, and I've had episodes on industrial agriculture, episodes on endocrine disruption, obesogenic chemicals, all of these kinds of things we're talking about. I've done episodes just on those topics and with leading experts in the world. So some of those may be of interest to your readers.
Definitely.
Or your
We'll
listeners.
link that in the description below so you can find his podcast and his book there.
Yep, for sure. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Nice to meet you guys.
You too.